can start.
There's still an audio issue?
Yeah. Okay.
Start.
Yes. Let's start.
Hi everybody and welcome to the module 2 of the certificate course. We missed a turn yesterday and there are some other changes which we will inform you about. But the modules will remain the same. We're not shortening the course or doing anything of that sort. So the modules will remain the same. It's just that we will have to swap around a little bit with the dates. Now, what I have lined up for today and for tomorrow, that is this week, is to talk about homosexuality around the world. Before we, in the next module, actually come to India, ancient India, medieval India, modern India, and then Indian cinema, Indian literature, and so on. That is in the third module. But here we're going to start with talking about homosexuality in different parts of the world, beginning with ancient Greece and Rome, and then France and Germany, England and America, Japan, and Malaysia. That's, I hope to cover that much, in today's and tomorrow's session. And then as part of this module, we come to section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which would require a separate class in itself, the whole history and passage of that law. And then we talk about gay marriage, civil unions, coalitions, intersectionality, inclusiveness, those are the other topics in this second module. This book, the name is given to you, Michel Foucault, Foucault Live, interviews 1961 to 1984. This is where Foucault talks about in this interview, about ancient Greece and Rome. Let me read certain relevant portions from the chapter on history and homosexuality, and then I'll explain and comment. Let me say before I forget, that the terms homosexual and heterosexual are terms that came into the English language as recently as the 19th century. Do you have to admit each time?
Yeah.
They did not exist earlier. So if you're talking about ancient Greece and Rome, this is the pre-BC area, the BC period, then obviously the words homosexual and heterosexual didn't even exist. And of course, the language wasn't English. But what Foucault says is, I quote, um, the ancient Greeks and Romans lacked the notion or concept of this division. This division, the division in question is the division between homosexuality and heterosexuality. And on the other hand, they didn't have the experience. Experience of what? Experience of homosexuality as we understand the term today. A person who went to bed with another of the same sex did not experience himself as a homosexual. And he says this seems to me fundamental. So this is interesting. A person had sex with someone of his own sex but did not experience himself as a homosexual. Um, then what did he experience himself, or what did he think of himself as? We are coming to that. When a man made love with a boy, the moral issue revolved around the question, was this man active or passive? And did he make love with a beardless boy? The appearance of a beard defined a cutoff point. The combination of these two types of dichotomy institutes a very complex profile defining morality and immorality. Thus, it makes no sense to say that homosexuality was tolerated by the Greeks. This is a misconception. Sometimes people say, oh, why make such a big issue about homosexuality? It was there in ancient Greece and even in Rome, and they didn't make such a big issue about it. But that's the whole point that Foucault is making, that it wasn't seen as homosexuality. Instead, it was seen as, and I'm going to use another word that he also uses, it was seen as sodomy. Now, sodomy has to do with anal penetration. And again, sodomy isn't gender specific, because a man, of course, in sodomy, it is the man who is the penetrator because a man has a penis. But the penetrated could either be another man, usually a boy, so it becomes man and boy, and there is an age differential over here, or it could even be a woman, right? So this is the difference between sodomy and homosexuality. That the term homosexuality implies that there is sex between two people of the same sex or same gender, and therefore it's a gender specific term. Gender specific in the sense that the two people have to be of the same gender, not gender specific in the sense that it only refers to men and not to women or other genders. It refers to all genders, but you know the people involved have to belong to the same gender, and it's gender specific in that sense. But with the term sodomy, that isn't the case. The other thing, before I read further, is that there's a difference between the term homosexual or homosexuality and sodomy, in that homosexuality implies consent. So the sexual act in question between two people of the same gender is consensual. And if it's consensual, then of course it it involves pleasure. But sodomy doesn't imply consent, and therefore, in the case of sodomy, it isn't really pleasure as much as it is power, and that is why Foucault speaks of men making love to boys. Um, I'll just read that further to make this clear to make this more clear. It is very difficult for a Greek or a Roman to accept the idea that a boy brought up by virtue of his condition as a free man, born of a noble family, to exercise familial and social responsibilities and assume power over others. Um, and then he says that, such a boy could become a Roman senator or a man of politics or a Greek orator. And for such men, it's very difficult to accept the idea for such boys who become men that they have been passive in their relationship with a man. Now, what passive means, I guess you know this. Passive means being penetrated, and active means being the penetrator, right? Um, so this is why it has to do with power, because if you're, what Foucault is really saying over here is that if you belong to a noble family, if you belong to aristocracy, if you are a man of status, then you will not accept being penetrated by another man. The men who are penetrated by other men are not free men, they are slaves. So he says um, that a man pursues a boy goes without saying, and that this boy be a slave, because slavery did exist at the time. Not slavery in the sense in which it existed in Africa, maybe, but slavery in the sense of domination did exist. And the boy who was passive in the sex act or who was sodomized, so you can use sodomy in its verb form, which would be sodomize. The boy who was sodomized was a slave. As the saying goes, I'm quoting from Foucault, and he uses the F word, so it's part of the quote, and I hope that that doesn't offend any of you. But this is the quote. As the saying goes, to be fucked is a necessity for a slave, a shame for a free man, and a favor returned for an emancipated slave. To be fucked is a necessity for a slave, a necessity, mind you, which means that the slave has no choice except to be penetrated. A shame for a free man, that's the opposite. So a free man, a free agent, anyone born of nobility, anybody who's upper class, aristocratic, has wealth and power and education and so on, would never agree to being penetrated. They would have, they would have anal. By the way, sodomy has to do with anal intercourse, right? And that's why I said that it was, in case you don't know the meaning of the term sodomy, and that is why I said that it was not a gender specific term like the term homosexual, because man can also have anal intercourse with a woman. But for a free man to be penetrated, right, to be a recipient of anal sex is a shame, according to Foucault. And then he says, for an emancipated slave, it could be a favor return. So, you talk in terms of sexual favors. In contrast, then, Foucault says, I'm continuing with what he writes over here. In contrast, it's immoral for a free young man to be fucked. So the same thing, that if you're a free agent, then you will not acquiesce to being penetrated. You will not have a problem with two men having sex, but the free agent among those two men, who's always older, and here also he speaks in terms of how do you define or how do you distinguish between a man and a boy? The slave is not just devoid of power, in terms of his social class, but is also younger. So it's also a boy. And how do you differentiate between a man and a boy? One way of differentiating between men and boys is that men have beards because they're older and they have facial hair, but the boys are so young, what we would call underage or minors, that very often they don't even have beards, and such boys would be slaves, or they would be sodomized by the older men, um, and that was the practice in both ancient Rome, which is now a part of Italy, as well as Greece, right? So this needs to be understood, the difference between sodomy and homosexuality. The term homosexual, as well as the term heterosexual, came into the English language only in the 19th century. They didn't exist earlier. They were not understood in the sense in which we understand the two terms today, because when you use the term homosexual, if I say someone's a homosexual, two guys are in a homosexual relationship, what that implies is that that relationship is consensual. Consent is the most important thing. And if it's consensual, then it's also pleasuresome to both of them. But if I use the term sodomy, even now, as it was used then that implies that it's not consensual, because only one of them has the freedom to decide, and the other doesn't, right? The one who is penetrated and who is in the position of a slave doesn't have the freedom to decide. We are not saying that that anal intercourse uh, cannot be pleasuresome. That sodomy can be. We're not saying that it's only um, the active partner who derives pleasure and not the passive partner. We're not saying that. But what we are saying is that the one who was passive doesn't have the option to also, what is called versatility, to also be active. The passive partner has no choice but to be the passive partner, right? Um, Likewise, the active partner would not condescend to being passive, because that would amount to shaming himself, as he says over here, and it was immoral for a free young man to be penetrated or to be fucked. That's what he says over here. So I hope you understand that distinction. Sodomy, the word is also used today, not that it isn't, but it's very similar to rape. If you understand the whole dialectics of rape, um, why do men rape? Is rape for pleasure or is rape for power? I think that in the women's movement, women have been struggling to express that rape has not to do with pleasure. Rape has everything to do with power, right? And to the extent that we equate sex with love, right? Um, Rape is not a loving act. It's the opposite of it. A rapist is a misogynist, pretty often or most of the time, who hates women, right? So there's no question of love. And I think that the term sodomy is closer to the term rape than it is to the modern term homosexual. So this is as far as ancient Greece. So the next time you hear, if because people do talk like that, this is something that was known in ancient Greece and Rome as well. I think that you have to educate them by pointing out that, well, it was there, but it wasn't homosexuality in the sense in which we use the term today, but it was sodomy. I can't ask them if this is clear because I can't hear them.
You can ask that if they have any question related to here, they can post it in the chat box.
Yeah, if there's any quick question on this, you will have half an hour for questions at 4 o'clock. But
If you have any question till
Just
what
put it,
Dr.
just one question to, this distinction between sodomy and homosexuality. But
Clear,
if there
sir.
are more
Yeah,
questions, then
no,
we
they
can.
have written clear, sir.
What?
Clear. Yes, this is all clear.
Okay, that's good. Now, let me come to France, of which I had already spoken a little bit, but let me put it in perspective. France is interesting because we're talking about, Foucault talks about, he himself is from France, and he talks about the 17th and 18th centuries, where France was very different from France in the 20th century. By the 20th century, France became very open, much more open than the United States. And I was recently teaching a novel by the African American writer James Baldwin, in which, the narrator, who's homosexual, leaves America and comes to France because, and there's another character from Italy who also leaves Italy, and that's where they meet in Paris. Because in Paris, you could be openly homosexual. Whereas in Italy as well as in America, we're talking about the 1960s, pre-Stonewall. The early 1960s is when the novel is set. The novel is called Giovanni's Room. If you want, I can put it down. Um, I teach it in my American literature class. How do I type here?
Yeah, just
So the novel is called Giovanni's Room, and the protagonist comes to Paris. So Paris was very open by that time. Also, in another classic novel by the um, British writer James Joyce, which is also autobiographical, Stephen Dedalus leaves Ireland, which is very repressive, Irish Catholic society, because he wants to be a writer, whereas his family wants him to join the order, the religious order, and he too comes to um, France, and that's where he can be a writer. So France in the 20th and 20th century and beyond the 20th century is very different from what it was earlier. Now, Foucault points out that in the middle of the 17th century, as well as in the 18th century, early 18th century, France was so repressive when it came to homosexuality that homosexual people were trapped. There were traps set up for homosexual people by the police, and they used spies and so on to trap homosexual people in the 17th and 18th centuries. So, so he says, I'll just read that. The second aspect is the practice of the police in regard to homosexuality, very clear in France in the mid 17th century, an epoch when cities actually exist. So, cities in the modern sense did exist at the time, where a certain type of police surveillance is in place, and where, for example, one observes the arrest, relatively massive, of homosexuals, and different neighborhoods and different towns are mentioned. One observes dozens of arrests, names are taken down, people are arrested for several days or are simply released. Some remain in the hole without a trial. A whole system of traps and threats is set up with cops and police spies a little world is put into place very early in the 17th and 18th centuries. So it was that bad, when it comes to the practice of homosexuality, the police have always been suspect, and that is what led in America to the Stonewall Riot in 1969. The riot was, between the LGBT community and the cops and the police. So whether it is France in the 17th and 18th century or America during Stonewall or India, So India is, and I think I read an excerpt from my own book, Criminal Love. If you read, if you get hold of the book, I've even talked about a personal experience more than one time actually with cops that I have had, um, you know, and there's this whole how should I put it? There's this whole um, there's this whole modus operandi, which exists between policemen and homosexuals. The policemen have a vested interest in not, because legally, if you're doing something that's illegal, of course, you may be caught by the police, but then it's their duty to, charge sheet you and see that the matter goes to the courts and let the judges decide, not the policemen at the lowest echelons of the police. But that is not how it is. They don't want the matter to reach the courts because they want a settlement, right? And the settlement is, and then of course I told you about the Matthew Shepard case, but there it was not policemen, but it was, truck drivers who turned out to be thugs. So it can the police, if thugs do it, you can understand it that they are thugs. But when policemen, who are law enforcing employees of the police force, take on the avatar of thugs, that is quite shocking, isn't it? But that is how it has been. I can tell you from personal experience that, including in Indian cities, the police have a nose for this. They get a whiff of where cruising activity goes on. Cruising activity in the pre-internet age, now there's the internet, and I don't know whether the police can even trap people, who go on to um, dating apps and so on. Perhaps they can, but maybe there, it's not as hazardous as it was in the pre-internet age, where cruising was physical, in that you either had you had gay bars. That's what happened at Stonewall. The police got to know that the Stonewall Inn was this bar, among many other bars on that street, Christopher Street. But they got to know that the Stonewall Inn was the bar where the LGBT community met, and they singled them out and would routinely harass them and so on until the riot happened. I'll talk about that. So whether it's a bar or it's a park, public park, or it's a washroom, they get the scent of it. They know that, okay, this is where this sort of activity happens. And then it becomes very easy for them to trap homosexuals. And this is to a large extent restricted to the male homosexual community, because women homosexuals, lesbians, tend to network in a somewhat different way. But for men, it often is the outdoors. I think that Aga Shahid Ali, who's dead now and who was a well-known Kashmiri poet, but also homosexual, and his work appears in recent gay anthologies in India, has this article where he talks about, about how do you identify policemen. because they often come in mufti. They don't come in uniform. If they came in uniform, you would know at once that they are cops, right? So they come in as plain clothes policemen. That's called mufti. But they forget to change their shoes. So Aga Shahid Ali in this very chilling essay, says that you look for the boots, the black boots. And that's true. Even before I read Aga Shahid Ali's essay, I knew that even in Bombay, we did it that way, that you saw their shoes, and if they had the kind of shoes that policemen wear, then you know that, well, this guy is a cop and you better be careful. But I have seen with my own eyes, them picking up people, beating them black and blue, and um, and then it's basically extortion, or it is you know if the people are the men who are thus trapped are poor and cannot pay up, then of course they, you know, they might be forced to have sex with these policemen, or they might be used to trap other men. So all this is possible, and I was very happy when just before this class, Renu told me that next week there is someone from the police
Police
force who is
Academy.
going to be talking to you because there is an attempt to sensitize the police, So this person who's been assigned by the police commissioner,
Police Commissioner.
yeah,
Mr. Giovanni.
probably is has been sensitized. But you can put these questions to him. I don't mind you quoting me and saying Professor Raj Rao said all this, and I've written about this in Criminal Love. It also figures in some of my short stories and so on. But it is not restricted to any one country. That's what, Foucault is talking about 17th and 18th century France, and I'm talking about 20th and 21st century India. There's a big difference both in terms of time as well as in terms of place. But it only proves how universal this is, right? Then I'm going to come to Germany and I'm going to read and extract from an essay of mine that appeared in this book called India in Diversity. I'll put the title down. The title of the book is India in Diversity, and it's edited by Francis Tarman, who's a German national and writer and professor, and Hilda David, who used to teach at Symbiosis College in the English department and is a friend. Both are friends of mine. So they were editing this book, India in Diversity, and asked me to contribute. Some of this appears in my own book, Criminal Love, but here it's more detailed, where I talk about Germany. Now, Germany, as you know, has this notorious history of Nazism, which no other country in the world has had. And when you think of the Nazis, of course, you think of the Jews as their victims. But along with the Jews, homosexual men were equally their victims. So that is what my, not the whole essay, but the part I'm reading is what concerns Germany and Nazi Germany. Last week, I visited the concentration camp at Dachau, Germany. So Dachau was one concentration camp. The most notorious was Auschwitz in Poland, but Dachau was equally scary. Set up in 1932 by the Third Reich, that's Hitler's party, on the grounds of an ammunition factory near Munich. This was Nazi Germany's first concentration camp and served as the model for all its other concentration camps. The concentration camp was run by the Schutzstaffel, that's the organization. In English, that would translate as Protection Battalion. Schutzstaffel. Incidentally, in my collection of poems, National Anthem and other poems, I have a poem, the title of which is SS. And I say in the poem that Schutzstaffel, if you use it as two words, would be SS, the acronym. And then I say that we also have, we at least had in the past, the equivalent of the Schutzstaffel in a party which had the same initials, SS, and that's of course the Shiv Sena. So that's my point. So the concentration camp was run by the Schutzstaffel or Protection Battalion that was better known by its initials SS. And then I say over here, perhaps it's no coincidence that one of our own political parties, whose politics, according to some, are similar to those of the Schutzstaffel, bear the same initials, and I have the Shiv Sena in mind. Mind you, I'm thinking of the old Shiv Sena. The new Shiv Sena is, I admire the new Shiv Sena of Uddhav Thackeray and Aditya Thackeray because I think they're standing up to the BJP and I think they're much more liberal. Aditya Thackeray, incidentally, studied BA, did his BA at St. Davis College in Bombay and speaks English very well and is very liberal. One has to be brave to visit Dachau, for one sees here with one's own eyes all that we have merely read about in history books. The wooden barracks designed for 5,000 prisoners, but which by 1942 were cramped with more than 12,000 prisoners huddled together. The gas chambers, euphemistically referred to as the showers, where prisoners were suffocated to death with poisonous gases, the incinerators in which corpses were burned, some only half dead. There are also archival photographs of the heaps of dead bodies that were left to rot in the open, for their number was so large that it was impossible to bury or cremate them. Now with the war in Ukraine, again, they're comparing what's going on in Ukraine with Nazi Germany. I mean, I've been reading comparisons of that kind. And yesterday, Renu, I was moved to tears to hear that an Indian student was killed.
Yes.
In the shelling. The poor guy just went out to get some food and imagine the
It's very good.
state of his parents. Survivors speak of the shockingly inhuman treatment meted out to them in the camps. They had to do hard manual or menial labor from morning to evening. They were starved. They constantly received debilitating blows and kicks from the SS men and the Gestapo. The Gestapo was also the notorious police force, the army actually, for even the smallest of lapses. The prisoners were kept so hungry that there are reports of some of them gnawing at the corpses of their comrades like cannibals to fill their hunger, fill their stomachs. Then there were diseases like typhoid that broke out in Dachau's unhygienic conditions and killed hundreds of inmates. The concentration camp at Dachau was surrounded by an outer wall enmeshed in barbed wire charged with electricity. A breakout attempt was thus bound to be fatal. However, some prisoners purposely tried to escape from the camp so that they could be shot dead by the SS and thus be relieved of their suffering. The largest group of prisoners in the concentration camps consisted of Jews whom Hitler wanted to exterminate. But a large number of the internees were homosexual men. The Nazis regarded homosexuals as degenerate, that's their word, and foreign to the community, that's also their expression. In 1935, Section 175 of the Criminal Code, which made homosexuality a crime, was applied to the prisoners at Dachau. Homosexual men were identified by a pink triangular patch that they were made to wear around their necks. The SS took it upon itself to torture and humiliate prisoners who wore the pink triangle. Their number steadily rose from 170 in 1939 to over 600 by the end of the war in 1945. Like the Jews, the homosexuals belonged to assorted European nationalities, but the majority of them were Germans, French, Russians, and Poles from Poland. One of the homosexuals interned at Dachau was a Jewish wine dealer by the name of Leopold Obermeier. He was told he would be in the concentration camp for 9 months, but this was eyewash. In truth, he was never released, and in 1942 he was sent from Dachau to another concentration camp at Mauthausen for, and this was again their phrase, extermination through work. He died there on February 22nd, 1943. Another homosexual prisoner at Dachau testifies to the slaps and kicks he got every day from the SS. How come you are here? They asked him, and voyeuristically made him describe all his offenses. A fellow prisoner wrote, and I quote, they wanted to know exactly what he had done and how, and then they went after him all over again, slapping and kicking him. You could read the delight and sadism in their faces. The Stonewall Riot of Greenwich Village, New York City, that symbolized gay revolution, took place exactly 24 years after the concentration camps at Dachau and elsewhere were destroyed. Ironically, the pink triangle, which was once a hateful symbol of homosexual persecution, became its dazzling emblem. Today, to sport the pink triangle is not to remind oneself of the shameful excesses of the Nazis in the 1940s, but to announce one's homosexuality to the world in a spirit of defiance and pride. And, I'm proud to say that when I went to America for the first time, even I picked up a T-shirt with a pink triangle. Pink triangles are available in any gay merchandise shops all over the Western world in the form of T-shirts, rings, and necklaces. And so that's what I refer to over here. I still possess the T-shirt I picked up in America in 1996. Actually, that was my second visit, with a large pink triangle and the word visible printed on it. Now, paragraph 175, let me read what that is. Paragraph 175, or section 175 in English, of the German Criminal Code made male homosexuality a crime. It was enforced from 1871 to 1994, more than 100 years. In 1935, the Nazis rigidified interpretations of Para 175, applying it not just to anal intercourse, or what was called sodomy in ancient Greece and Rome, but also to acts not involving physical contact, such as masturbating side by side, as gay men often did in washrooms. After that, convictions increased tenfold to about 8,000 per year. The Gestapo sent as many as 15,000 homosexual men to its concentration camps for extermination through work. Most of them died there as a result of the torture and exhaustion. In February 1933, the Nazi Party launched its purge of homophiles, which was the term used to describe gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, not homosexual, but homophile. Gay groups were banned, Books on homosexuality were burned, and homosexual men within the Nazi Party itself were killed. Kurt Hiller of the Magnus Hirschfeld Institute of Sex Research was arrested and sent to a concentration camp. The Gestapo constituted a special division to compile lists of homophiles that were forced to sexually conform to the German heterosexual norm. Those who were lucky managed to flee Germany. So this heterosexual norm, is what heteronormativity is about which I talked earlier. Those who were lucky managed to flee Germany. Those who could not escape became Hitler's Holocaust victims along with the Jews. The Nazis were against gay men because they saw them as subversives, that's their word, who got in the way of that is the Nazis' creation of a master race. That was the aim of the Nazis, to create a master race. Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the Staffel or SS, glorified the masculine ideal and the idea of a brotherhood among men. Homosexuality, according to him, contradicted these ideals. Himmler was alarmed that Germany had lost as many as 4 million men during the First World War, thus upsetting the balance of the sexes in Germany. This is a quote from Himmler. The need of the hour was for men to marry women and beget children, obviously male children, failing which the country was surely headed, again a quote, for insignificance in 50 to 100 years and for burial in 250 years. Unquote. Homosexuals were to be despised, for they were, again a quote, no longer capable of having sex with a female. Unquote. While sending homosexuals to concentration camps, leniency was shown towards those who displayed Aryanness, that is, coming from true Germanic stock, and those who had managed to father children. In the 12 years of Nazi rule between 1933 and 1945, as many as 1 lakh homosexual men were arrested by the Gestapo and the SS. Most of them were sent to regular prisons, but as stated above, about 15,000 of them were sent to concentration camps. Statistics show that the death rate of homosexual prisoners in the concentration camps was considerably higher than that of other prisoners. Whilst about 60% of the homosexual prisoners died here, the figure for other prisoners has been placed at roughly 40%, implying that, the homosexual prisoners were subject to greater torture. This is because homosexual men were treated in an unusually cruel manner by their captors. They were persecuted not only by the German soldiers, but also by other prisoners whom the soldiers encouraged. The non-homosexual prisoners also tortured the homosexual ones. The persecution, needless to say, included sexual assault, highly plausible in the cramped concentration camps, in which by 1945 the men were virtually sleeping on the wooden bunks, one on top of the other. The SS and other non-Jewish prisoners made sure that the gay men in the camps were given more arduous and life-threatening work than the others, and in the end, many of them were beaten to death. Those who did not die were used as guinea pigs by the Nazi physicians to locate, I quote, a gay gene to cure any future Aryan children. So they thought they could cure homosexuality by locating a gay gene. But the most bone-chilling form of torture occurred when the SS men used homosexuals for target practice, aiming their guns and rifles at the downward-pointing pink triangles that the latter were forced to wear around their necks. Then I just end by saying what happened after the Nazis were finished. After the war, East Germany reverted to the old version of the law, restricting the definition of homosexuality to anal intercourse. So homosexuality and sodomy were still the same thing. In 1968, homosexuality was made a punishable offense only if it involved a boy under the age of 18. So they were, slowly moving towards a more liberal approach. In 1988, no, in 1968, homosexuality was made a punishable offense only if it involved a boy under the age of 18, a minor. In 1988, East Germany abolished the law altogether. West Germany, on the other hand, retained the Nazi law till 1973 and revoked it altogether only in 1994 after the German reunification of 1989. And then the 21st century, in 2002, the German government apologized to the gay community for its excesses during the Holocaust. A memorial to the gay and lesbian victims of National Socialism, that's the wording on the memorial, stands in the city of Cologne today. It reads in German, I'm not reading the German, but in English it reads, struck dead, hushed up. So, by the 21st century, of course, Germany is, of course, very, very ashamed of its Nazi past. I have very good friends in Germany, and I keep going there, and I'm going there again, maybe in July to teach and to meet my friend Ingrid. But I know that they are highly ashamed of their Nazi past and would like to disown it. But history cannot be wished away. So this was how it was, not even 100 years ago, in Germany, which of course we think of as a liberal Western country. And then I'm going to talk about England. Now, of course, England in a way is our mother country because we were colonized by the British for right from 1600 when the East India Company came to India, and then in 1857 power was transferred to the British Crown. Queen Victoria became our ruler, and we finally won independence only in 1947, isn't it? So we have a kind of umbilical relationship with the English, and it was they, of course, who introduced the penal code. Lord Thomas Babington Macaulay, actually his first, some would call it his first um, oppressive act was had nothing to do with sexuality, but it had to do with language and education. Was in was in 1833 when he overnight um, came up with this new education policy which made English compulsory. That's how English first came into India, and it changed everything, right? And there were people in Bengal, such as Ram Mohan Roy, even before Macaulay, who were arguing for introducing English, Raja Ram Mohan Roy and others. But Macaulay actually managed to see that that became the law. T.B. Macaulay. So that is, as far as he wrote this document called Minute on Education. And he said that a single shelf in a British library had more worthwhile stuff than all the books in Sanskrit and the ancient Indian languages which had outlived their utility. So that was a very narrow-minded way of looking at it and a very ill-informed way of looking at it. But that was how it was. But then in 1860 or 1861, when he drew up the penal code, which had to do with criminal offenses. Unnatural sex, this is what he called it, became a criminal offense. not just in India, but in all British colonies, so British colonies in Africa, in the Caribbean, and other parts of the world where they had colonies because by the 19th century, England was ruling almost, large parts of the world. And the number of the section or the article was the same in all these colonies. It was the notorious number 377, right? About which I'm going to, of course, have a separate session with you because it was something that really, changed the whole approach to same-sex love in India, which was not a criminal offense up until that point, but it became a criminal offense from that point onwards, and continued to remain a criminal offense till just, would you believe, till just 3 years ago. So right from 1861, three, uh, yeah, 3.5 years ago, right from 1861 up until September 2018, it was a criminal offense. Um, so this was England. Now, obviously, when England introduced um, the penal code and made unnatural sex an offense. So, according to them, the first problem there is that they saw um, homosexuality, and again, they didn't use the word homosexuality, but they talked about unnatural sex, which implied anal sex, which is also non-procreative sex. So it's not restricted to just homosexuals, but heterosexuals can also have unnatural sex in that respect. And it became a punishable offense. One could be put in jail for a long time, one could be fined, and so on. Now, this was not just in their colonies, but obviously the same law applied in the home country as well. So, in the 19th century, um, and at least the first half of the 20th century, it was as bad in England as it was in France. Maybe not as bad as Germany because the Nazis weren't in England, but it was bad because it was a punishable offense. And I think that one of the one of the famous men who suffered the most on account of this law was the writer Oscar Wilde, you know, who was sent to jail because he was defiantly homosexual. There were other homosexuals who were more sort of circumspect about their homosexuality. There were other writers as well who came after Oscar Wilde. I can think of two, both W.H. Auden, the poet, and especially E.M. Foster, the novelist, were homosexual, but they were not as upfront as Oscar Wilde was. And so, in Foster's case, the only explicitly homosexual novel that E.M. Foster wrote was a novel called Morris, which is also made into a film. So I'll put that down. But this novel was not published during his lifetime. It was published after his death and it's now available as a film, so you can check the film out. In his other well-known novel, Passage to India, there's a suggestion of a kind of homosexual friendship between uh, two characters, the British character Fielding and the Indian doctor, Dr. Aziz, but that's only a suggestion. They're not, it's nowhere stated that they're actually homosexual. So he was that careful. Likewise with the poet W.H. Auden. But Oscar Wilde was upfront. He believed in being openly subversive, transgressive. In this book called, I'll put this down also. Um, The author is Jonathan Dollimore, and the first part of the title of his book is Sexual Dissidence. And the first chapter in this book is an anecdotal chapter, which describes an meeting between Oscar Wilde and the French writer André Gide in a foreign country in Africa. But this anecdotal chapter, shows us the difference um, in the approach of both these writers towards their homosexuality. André Gide was closeted. He was also a very pious Christian and felt that, um, he didn't know how to reconcile his um, belief in religion with his sexuality. So he probably chose to be celibate. But when they met in Algiers, Oscar Wilde that night, André Gide tried to avoid him, but he couldn't avoid him. And Oscar Wilde tempted him, took him to the red light area and introduced him to a male sex worker and tempted him to spend the night with him and he had a night of sex and he enjoyed it, but then by morning he was overcome with guilt and he wrote a letter to his mother, Andre Gide, uh, almost calling Oscar Wilde an incarnation of the devil, of Satan, and saying that he made me do something that is a sin and so on. So this was Oscar Wilde. I mean, he was very upfront, transgressive, subversive. He um, believed in almost flaunting his homosexuality at a time when it was a crime in England, and he suffered. Actually, in 1895, he died on account of the torture inflicted on him in prison. That's what it is said. So the England of that time was different. Then, about 100 years after the penal code was introduced, around 1961, England, of course, abolished the law, and that's one of the things that the support groups in India have been saying, that if the law was introduced by England and when England withdrew the law 100 years later, shouldn't India have also withdrawn the law at the time? But we did not, because by then we had become victims of amnesia and we even forgot that this was a British law and we thought that homosexuality was against Indian culture and so on. So we didn't get rid of the law at the same time that England did. And England, also apologized to, as in Germany, they apologized to the LGBT community for the suffering that was inflicted on them, which in India, no such apology has come our way from the powers that be. So this was, how it was in England at the time. Um, in the 19th century and 20th century, beyond the second half of the 20th century, till, of course, they abolished the law. And then, and even then, I mean, things came in degrees. It's not that once a law is abolished, it's a sort of free for all. Because I happened to do my postdoctoral research in a British university in the year, specifically in the year 1990, and even then, by then, of course, sexuality had become politicized in England, but there was a long way to go. I mean, in terms of legalizing gay marriage and, and so on. So there were a lot of student gay groups and faculty gay groups on campuses. I met well-known gay academics like Richard Dyer and so on in Warwick. I used to attend the student gay groups. That's actually, as I say in many interviews that I've given, that was my own turning point, because till then I was in India and completely closeted. But that year in England, made me see the need to come out of the closet and politicize one's sexuality if one had to acquire rights. So this is how activism begins. Though in my case, the activism was through my writing and not through and teaching. Because I was a university professor and still I am actually. I've been teaching for 43 years, but not through support groups the way Ashok or Bindu ran support groups because I was not good at that sort of thing. But it was activism all the same, and I picked it up in England in that year. But it was not as if everything was hunky dory, even in England. That's also what I realized. But the beginning had been made, and that was nice, right? Whereas in India, we had to wait for that law to um, be challenged first in the Delhi High Court and then reinstated and then again challenged in the Supreme Court, and it was pretty messy actually. And I'm going to talk about that in a later class. Now, let me finish off with America. I talked about Greece, Rome, France, Germany, England. And when it comes to America, of course, Stonewall becomes the turning point. The Stonewall Riot happened precisely on 26 June 1969 um, in this bar, just outside this bar called the Stonewall Inn. By the way, that's a name I've given to my weekend house in Lonavala. Um, the neighbors don't understand what that is because they've given typical names to their houses. And they ask some of my staff, and even my staff don't know what it means. So they say, oh, there's a wall made of stone, and that's why it's called Stonewall. But it's not just the name. I mean, I've got memorabilia from Stonewall. There's a painting that my friend Geeta Vishwanath, two paintings actually that she did, including one of a sign that was put up in the Stonewall Inn soon after the riot, which says this is a raided premises. So she did a replica of that. And there are books on Stonewall. So there's a book by Martin Duberman, which gives you the whole history of. It's called. Stonewall. The author is Martin Duberman, and the title of the book is Stonewall. So, what is Stonewall? Stonewall Inn was the name of this bar where the LGBT community met to network, to meet, to feel good in each other's company. They were not doing anything obscene or vulgar. They just wanted to, you must realize that if you're in a heteronormative setup, if you're homosexual or lesbian, and you see a lot of this now in some of the web series, if you're fond of seeing web series um, on Hotstar or Prime or whatever. I'm seeing one currently called City of Dreams, and there again there are these, there's this lesbian woman, and you see that there's a lot of loneliness. You have to understand that being um, being LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and all the other sexualities, as opposed to heterosexuality, is not just a sexual preference, but it also has to do with one's emotions because obviously you are you are in a minority, you're lonely, um, and the laws of the land are against us. Social attitudes and mindsets are against us. We don't have an infrastructure. We don't have institutions such as marriage and the creation of families in the traditional sense. So all that can be quite sort of quite depressing, isn't it? Um, so if you have a place where people of the same orientation can meet and feel good in each other's company and have a drink and exchange phone numbers and so on, they're not actually having sex over there. What's the harm? But even that liberty was not allowed to people of the LGBT community. in New York City, which is New York. It's not, I think I read an excerpt from Dr. Abraham Varghese' book, My Own Country, which is set in Johnson City in Tennessee, which is the Bible
Yes.
Belt. So if you're talking about provincial America, it's one thing. But you're talking about New York, which in some ways, even then, 1969 is not that far away, 20th century, is one of the most liberal places on earth that you can be in, right? And this is a district known as the Village, Greenwich Village, which has a string of bars and, so that's all that these gay men and women and trans people, were doing. I mean, they were feeling good in each other's company. They were making friends. They were also because they were this was the beginnings of the politicization of sexuality. They were talking about how do you sort of come together, and many of them were homosexual, but they were also homopolitical. You fight for rights, and how do you acquire rights and so on, because they were all highly educated people. They were not just some riffraff. They were highly articulate, educated people. They were professors. They were creative people, painters, writers, um, intellectuals, and so on. But and there were societies that were already formed, like the Mattachine Society, around that time in America. Just as you have Humsafar Trust and Sampathik Trust and so on now in India. But the police did not leave them alone, and they knew that this is where the LGBT community routinely meets. So they started to harass them uh, by just sort of storming into the bar and picking them up and arresting them um, for no perceivable offense, beating them up. And this went on for quite some time, actually. They were subject to this harassment for quite some time. Um, and like I said, before that time, even as late as the early '60s, I mentioned the novel Giovanni's Room, which is set in 1963. Also, the film Brokeback Mountain. Did I mention that earlier? Which you must see. You can easily find this on Netflix. Set in rural America in cowboy country, actually in the state of Wyoming in 1963, where you can be homosexual, but you can't be open about it, right? There is fear, there is shame, there is fear of that you're doing something illegal, immoral, uh, obscene, and so on. So this was how it was, even in the as late as the 1960s. That is why Stonewall, the whole coming together at Stonewall was meant to change that. But they were not even allowed to do that. And then, it was as if they were saying enough is enough. So that on this particular night, I think it just happened, um, it was not even, I don't know, it was planned to some extent, but it was really a gut level reaction because, they all met, and that particular night, they usually met in the evening, but that night, that day, 26th June, and, in the summer in New York, the daylight exists till about 9 or 10 in the night, so it wasn't dark. They were all there, and more of the LGBT community were coming, and the police were also there. And then suddenly something snapped, and it was past midnight when everybody inside the bar came out and attacked the police. They just sort of went for them, left, right, and center. They went for them, beat them up. Maybe some of them had guns and they shot at them. They set fire to property. Things that the police, habitually did with the LGBT community. Um, were now happening to the police. It was a payback in a way. The police were getting a taste of their own medicine, and they suffered heavy casualties. The LGBT community outnumbered the number of police because I think the police didn't expect that this would happen, and then they try to send in more, more contingents of and more posses of policemen, but it was too late by then. Um, the media, the newspapers, television was still not what it was now, but the newspapers arrived there and all that. But the upshot is that the police suffered heavy casualties, and in a way, it was victory for the LGBT community, right? That they had asserted themselves, they had given out this message that enough was enough, and we will not be messed around with, and we have a right to, to exist and to. And America called itself a democracy long before that time, right from the 19th century, from the time of Abraham Lincoln, and once slavery was abolished and all that, America prided itself on its democracy, and this was more than 100 years after that time, and they were still being treated, like slaves. So they gave it back to the police. And in a way, some people don't even like to call it a riot because the word riot has a negative connotation. They prefer to call it an uprising. It was an uprising, like the 1857 uprising here in India against the British. So that then changed things, right? Because from that time onwards, then again by degrees, gay rights came into the forefront. Gay revolution. It didn't. I'm not suggesting that overnight after Stonewall, everything was hunky dory and things changed overnight. Again, it was in stages and degrees. It was the beginnings of activism. It was the beginnings of politicizing one's sexuality. Um, and then it took a while, of course, but it happened and it spread. It spread to other parts of America, at least liberal America. Liberal America, even today, is basically New York and California, and maybe a little bit of Chicago thrown in. You've been there, right?
Yes.
Would you agree that
Absolutely.
because large parts of America are even worse than India today?
Yes.
But
Some of the states.
liberal America is basically New York and California.
Virginia, Washington.
Yeah, the East
East,
Coast,
East Coast is
somewhat,
yeah.
but not Middle America.
Yeah.
And then in the West, of course, it's mainly California, LA, and especially San Francisco. I've done readings in these cities. There used to be by the time I went there, there was even a chain of bookstores across America, across liberal America, called A Different Light. And I remember doing readings because they specialized in gay literature, and any writer from any part of the world who wrote gay novels or poetry or nonfiction, was welcomed, and you did readings and so on. So I'm very proud to say that I've been there, done that. So from that time onwards, first it spread to other parts of America and quickly actually Europe was ahead of America. France and Germany by that time, and even England around the same time had got rid of Article 377. So in many ways, Europe was, um, Europe didn't have to learn from America, right? But it made an impact, and then by 1990, it came here. I think that Ashok Kavi deserves more credit than we seem to give him because he was the first openly homosexual man in India, in Bombay, and against all odds, he started the Humsafar Trust and a newsletter called Bombay Dost um, in the year 1990. I would. There are people like Hoshang Merchant, the poet, but Hoshang Merchant wrote literature. You see, with literature, what happens is literature provides an alibi because you can always say that this is imagined, this is fiction. Even my first book of short stories came out in 1995. It had some very explicitly homosexual short stories, But if anyone, of course, Ismat Chugta in 1945 in India was um, arrested for obscenity, but she won the case, because again they argued that it was in a book and it didn't mean that it really had happened and so on, whatever she was talking about, even though it went against an injunction in the Quran that two people of the same sex cannot sleep under the same quilt. But she won the case. And then there was Suniti Namjoshi. But with writers, you see, the point I'm making is that one can say that this is imagined. But with activism, they can just sort of come and say, "What are you up to? Who are these people you're um, talking to?" Or they can use words like instigating and so on. And you're doing something that's against the law. Because if you're an activist, you need an office, you need printed literature. Um, so I think that against all odds, I remember when Bombay Dost, he used to sell it in a basement shop in Bandra, in this Veena Bina shopping complex, just opposite Bandra station. And when you went there, they first asked for your credentials and so on before they gave you a copy because they had to be sure that you were not a cat among the pigeons, right? And then they gave it to you. So, I think that he deserves a lot of credit. I'll tell you something about myself. When I started by writing very explicit homosexual short stories, and ironically, they first appeared in this magazine in Bombay called Debonair, which is a very girly magazine. It's supposed to be the Indian version, at least at that time. I don't know if it's still around. It used to be called the Indian version of Playboy. And here I was publishing these explicitly homosexual short stories and feeling very proud about it because, it was a glossy magazine, showing it to friends, but I distinctly, and students, because I had started teaching by then, but I distinctly remember being apologetic. I laugh at myself and even feel ashamed of myself now when I think of that time by telling them, that this is the story of a friend who told me all this, lest they suspect that it's me. This was 1985, right? Even before Ashok started the Humsafar Trust. Then 10 years later, of course, the book came out. But by then, I had gone to England in 1990, and that completely changed me. So by the time the books came out, I said, to hell with it. Then Riyadh and I met, and he made Bombay. You must catch Bombay. And I just discovered that it is on YouTube. So this is a short film directed by Riyadh Wadia, based on 6 of my poems. Okay. So Stonewall, becomes this flashpoint. It becomes this catalyst that then, of course, changes things, but in a very small way, not in a major way. And tomorrow, I will talk about countries from the East like Japan and Malaysia, and you'll see that there, and of course, um, needless to say, with the Muslim world, it's still as bad as it always was. It's only the tip of the iceberg, really. There's a lot more to be done. So, what did we do today? We talked about Greece and Rome, ancient Greece and Rome. We talked about France and Germany. Um, we talked about the scene there. We talked about England and America and the Stonewall Riot. Um, so, we can have a discussion.
Sorry, due to some technical issue at my system, we will not be able to hear you. So please post your questions in the chat box. you please elaborate on the phrase politicizing homosexuality?
I covered this before. The moment you come out of the closet, the moment you begin to see your sexual orientation as your identity, you are politicizing sexuality. Till you do that, it's only an aspect of desire. It's desire, it's a preference, and nothing more than that. But when you come out of the closet, coming out of the closet implies that you are saying that you're homosexual, because unless you say that, there's an assumption of heterosexuality. I talked about that too. There is in human beings and indeed in all living things an assumption of heterosexuality. No matter how feminine a man is or how masculine a woman is or a trans person is, you know, mainstream society will always assume that we are attracted to the other sex, opposite sex, that men are attracted to women and women are attracted to men. That assumption will always be there, right? Now, how do you dismantle that assumption? How do you tackle that assumption? The way to tackle, because that assumption, a further question arises over here, and that is that is such an assumption to our advantage or to our disadvantage? If you're short sighted, you will think that it is to my advantage because I can do what I want, but nobody will come to know. In other words, I will merge with the crowd and I will be like everybody else. But if you're far-sighted, you will see that it is not to your advantage, but your disadvantage, because it means that you're continuously got to be on your guard. You continuously have to find excuses, for doing or not doing what they expect you to do. In short, you're leading a schizophrenic life. One is your secret private life, which only you know and your lovers know, and the other is what the public, including your families, parents, siblings, and so on, know. So therefore, in the long run, it's not to your advantage to remain closeted. Now, when you realize that and you say, okay, I'm going to come out of the closet, coming out of the closet doesn't mean that you shout from the rooftops or you make an affidavit and put it in the newspapers. It happens selectively, usually starting with parents and the family or close friends, or as in some cases, as in my case, for example, through my writing. I never actually sat my folks down and said, look, this is how it is. But, I started writing stories, poems, and, that's how they found out. So there are different ways of doing that. But that implies then that, that why do you do it? You do it because the other thing over here is that, which I think that sadly is lacking in the Indian education system, to be aware of our identity. And we have multiple identities, not just a sexual identity. We have racial identities, class and caste identities, ethnic identities, gender identities, linguistic identities, religious identities, and sexual identities. So to be aware of your identity, which, like I said, is sadly lacking in the Indian education system because you're not encouraged, to really think of your identity. If you think of the average student in school or even in college, the student doesn't matter, right? You're being taught something that is produced by others, and the teacher is a kind of intermediary. But where does the student matter? How are you a part of the learning process? The moment you begin to see that, then of course you become conscious of the fact that that you have an identity, and sexual orientation, for some people at least, for sexual minorities, is an important aspect of their identity. Um, when you realize that, you've already politicized it. So that's what the phrase politicizing sexuality means. It basically means, coming out of the closet and asserting who you are, asserting your preference. Um,
I have another question.
Are you ragging me or what? I wrote on Scroll about this film that my friend Onir was trying to make, on soldier in the army, Major J. Suresh, who left the army because he's homosexual and he felt he was not comfortable, and the defense ministry didn't give him the permission to make that film. I wrote about it in scroll.in. You can or you can share it. It's laughable, my friend. When you when you put names like Bipin Rawat or VK Singh and all that, I don't regard them as. I don't know how you see them. I don't see army people as. They are, for me, they are jokers. I don't think you need a standing. Then we just sort of digress a little bit, but I, I I don't think you need a standing army, um, and I don't think that war is um, even necessary, right? Um, Even as we talk, I was trying to tell some of my students in Pune University who are part of the student movement that what are the students doing? Why aren't they coming together? I hope that happens in JNU or somewhere, and asking our government to take a stand on the Russian aggression. We are isolated. Um, do we need war? Do we need any war? So the army, and their regressive views. I have a cousin who retired as a lieutenant general, and we are not even on speaking terms. He lives in the same city as I do, but we are not even on speaking terms because his views and my views are like the sun and the moon or something. And so, what are your thoughts? Please elaborate in this. The same in the. They are hypocrites. They are hypocrites. You think there is no homosexuality in the army? I think the Americans are more honest because right from Bill Clinton's time, they first started with a don't ask, don't tell policy. That is, you can be homosexual. The army, see, anywhere where which are single sex spaces. And if you think of army non-family stations, they are like sailors, right? Or people in prisons. These are single sex spaces. And people do have sex with people of their own sex because if nothing else, they don't have access to the opposite sex. Men don't have access to women and women don't have access to men. So, are you telling me that there is no homosexuality in the army? But to say that it's unacceptable and all that, is hypocrisy and homophobia, right? And heteronormativity and all the terms that I've already introduced and spoken about. So, it's laughable. If people like Bipin Rawat and VK Singh and others who hold these views actually bothered to sit with activists like myself and academics, people like Ashok, Parmesh, so many of us, believe me, they would lose the argument. They would never win the argument. That's why they don't come forward, right?
I asked you out of sheer curiosity. Thank you for answering.
Yeah, I thought you would know that by now that I'm completely anti-establishment, anti-army, anti-police, anti-forces. And that comes through in recent times. I've written all these short pieces for Scroll. Scroll is one of the, in this age of what they call Godi media, Wire, Scroll among online or TV channels. I think there's just NDTV 24/7 that I can, even with any sense of shame, mention. That you can watch and really get, because I also did journalism long back after my MA, between my MA and PhD. I think that writers and media people, journalists, have to be watchdogs of the constitution. You don't toe the government line, but here you have these channels, openly. The worst is, of course, Arnab Goswami is unwatchable, but it's not just he. Even CNN has become like that. And then, Rahul tells me that, okay, you're only seeing the anchors. Do you know who owns it? Ambani or Adani, one of them owns it. Somebody said there are 4 Gujarati men who are running this country. You know who they are. 2 are politicians and 2 are money bags. That's it.
Any more questions?
We have time, so go on. Were there questions last time that we were not able to take up?
No, the last time we took all the questions.
We took all?
Yeah, we took all the questions.
Yeah, the fact that we can't hear their voices. If any of you has a contrary view to what I'm saying, you can, that would be nice, because then we can debate it, isn't it? You don't have to necessarily agree to everything I'm saying. So if you have a contrary view,
criticism plays a very big part in the development of anything.
Yeah. If it was a physical class, it would be different. There would always be hands going up.
Yeah.
The time I did the guest
lecture,
yeah. And they were much younger.
3 years.
If there's anything that I covered earlier, since we have some time, I mean, if you want me to go over it, it seems to me that some of these terms, this business of politicizing sexuality, some of them are still not clear about it. People are leaving.
Yeah.
Where is that?
Rajiv, you have any question?
While they think of their questions, let me tell them about some of these videos.
Yes. We can do that. Okay. Thank you, Rajiv. Okay. So there is one question. I'll just read it for you. As you have mentioned that the word like homosexuality and heterosexuality came into the English dictionary in the 19th century, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist in our society before the 19th century. Can we say that it came to be known only when people came out of the closet? In day-to-day life, I encounter with many people who say that it is the effect of the West only. I agree.
No, these are not words. Homosexual, heterosexual, they are not a preference. And I'm talking here about the English language. Of course, the preference existed. I'm not saying that people were not attracted to people of their own sex, but they didn't have a word for it in English till the 19th century, and actually in the Indian languages till even later. The word homosexual, there were terms of abuse were known. Like in every language, there were terms of abuse, but a descriptive term that explained what it meant. What is the word? Can you state a word that defines a kind of sexual preference that people have for their own sex and not the opposite sex? The words for it came later in Indian languages. For example, in Hindi, the word samlaingik is much later than even the 19th century. It's only in the 20th century. So when you say that, what you mean is that the preference existed, but people didn't know how to articulate it. People didn't know what the word is to describe. In this film, in this Marathi film, Umbartha, I think that was a film also I put on your reading list. In the late 70s, this Marathi film, Umbartha, directed by Japar Patel, set this is set in a home for destitute women in rural Maharashtra. And two women are found out, in close embrace one night on the terrace, spotted first by the male watchman, and he blows the whistle and so on. And then all the other women in that in that home for they're all destitute women, battered women, abandoned by their husbands, by their in-laws. They all come and they don't side with these two women. They are on the side of the watchman who thinks that these two women have committed an offense. But the next day when they go to report the matter, they go in a big group to the superintendent's office, and they want these two women removed from that home. Now the superintendent is flabbergasted. She's trying to understand what they are saying because she was not there, and they don't know how to explain it. They don't know the word. They didn't know the word lesbian then, right? Which is anyway a word in the English language, and they didn't know English. And in the language that it's a Marathi film because it's set in rural Maharashtra. In Marathi, there was no word for it. So in Marathi, they say to the superintendent when she finally calms them down and says, "Tell me, for God's sake, what happened." In Marathi, they say, "He don't buy te purush kartat te karat hota," something like that. That is to say, these women were doing what a man and woman do. स्त्री आणि पुरुष करतात हे दोघी मुलगी ते करत होता, something like that in Marathi. So they were even formulating it in heterosexual terms. It was that bad, right? Now, if you don't have a word for something, I think that's the worst kind of oppression, because you have an instinct, you have a preference, you have um, a desire, but in the languages that we speak, there's no word for it. If there's no word for it, how can you think in terms of rights and so on? Right? It's the best way to be silenced. If it cannot even be articulated in language, it's the best way then to be silenced. And that is where we come to what I said and what Foucault says about Greece and Rome, that sodomy, in their languages, again, sodomy is an English word, but he means that in Greek and in Roman of the time, sodomy was known, but the connotations of sodomy are different from the connotations of the word homosexual. I explained that at the starting of my talk, that sodomy has to do with power with a more powerful man penetrating a less powerful, anally penetrating a less powerful man or woman or trans person. So that hasn't to do with love or pleasure. It has to do with power. You must understand the difference between pleasure and power, especially those of you who are law students, because sexual crimes, criminal offenses, sexual criminal offenses or sexual crimes um, have to do with non-consensual sex, which is about power and not about pleasure. You can speak of a sexual act as pleasuresome only when it is consensual. You can't speak of a sexual act as being pleasuresome if only one of the two or more people involved is deriving pleasure out of it, but the others are not. Then it becomes a question of power. And like I said, with rape, it seems to me that rather than love, it is misogyny. It's this hatred of women in men that makes them rapists.
Another question by Saloni. Could I know why you are critical about stories on LGBT plus by Devdutt Patnaik?
They're not stories. I mean, he writes, reinterprets mythologies for us. So they're not stories in the sense in which the novels are stories or short stories are stories. They're not fiction. They're sort of retelling of mythologies. I'm critical because there's an over reliance on mythologies come from religion, and there's an over reliance on religion. That's the reason I'm critical, because then, and in his case, it becomes Hinduism. So then, the message you're giving off is that, well, this is Hinduism is India's religion and so on. And that is not a message that I am sympathetic to, because there are other religions as well. And I think that one of the meanings of cultural modernity is to distance yourself from anything that's too overtly religious and look at it with a degree of criticality and skepticism, but not sort of celebrate it, because in Devdutt Patnaik's writing, it seems to be a celebration of um, Indian mythology. That's my problem with him, that is not a modernist approach. You don't have to be an atheist. I'm not saying that, but religion should be something that I compare it exactly. It's like sex. You don't go on talking about who you slept with. We all have sex, but we don't talk about it. When we're talking about these things, is not the same as talking about sex. We're talking about sexuality as identity, right? So you have to understand the difference. That was also the answer to the previous question about politicizing sexuality. Some people misunderstand. I'm not telling you who I sleep with and so on. I'm not telling you how we do it. There's with the male homosexuality and even women's lesbianism. There's a lot of voyeuristic curiosity in people. That's why we see porn, right? How do you do it? I remember we were in this Lit Fest in Shillong, and Wendell Rodrigues, poor guy, passed away. A fashion designer, famous fashion designer, Wendell Rodrigues from Goa. And we were on the panel, and one of the things he said to the young audience, was that, look, don't ask us how we do it. You know, you figure that out for yourself, because um, that's a very heterosexist question. You won't ask a man and a woman how they do it. So you think that there's only one way of doing it, which is the way men and women do it. Now you want to know how two women do it or how two men do it. It's voyeurism And, so that's not what we are talking about over here, right? So it's like that, religion too is not something I can quietly say my prayers. I can believe in any god or deity I want, um, but I don't sort of flaunt it. And okay, you write about it in a way Arun Kolatkar writes about Jejuri in his famous poem. He goes there, but he goes there with a somewhat skeptical eye. He's, you know, thinking of it more in humanity terms and not just in terms of ritual. But when you celebrate mythologies in the way, Devdutt Patnaik, and he's not the only one, there's Amish Tripathi, there are these are books that are selling, which also alarms me because it means that this is what Indian readers want, right? You go to any book fair or any bookstore, this is what is there. Amish Tripathi, Ashok Banker, Devdutt Patnaik, all of them. So that's the answer to your question.
There is another question by Nandini Jaiswal. Sorry. Okay. So, some Hindus claim that in ancient India, homosexuality was very much tolerated and that homophobia is a Western concept brought to India by the British, whereas others argue that homosexuality was not tolerated but rather
Fetishized.
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 What are your thoughts on this?
So we are going to have a separate module. If you see module 3, the representation of alternative sexuality in ancient India. So I won't answer that now because we have a whole module on India. I first wanted to talk about other parts of the world and then come to India. So
sorry, Nandini, you'll get
your answer,
but
you'll have to just be a little patient.
Save this and you will ask, please ask this when we will begin with the third module. Purushottam Rajak, mental health of the LGBT people is such an issue that needs special care as they undergo extreme forms of alienation and depression before and after coming out of the closet. What is the scenario of this in India? How far organizations or individuals are coming forward to help them?
There are two kinds of help. One is, of course, medical help, and that I think doctors are in a better position to answer. And I think you do have some.
We have one session wherein a medical professional will answer this question, but with regard to other, yes.
So the other aspect is the support groups, and I think that support groups are providing a lot of counseling. They do have counselors, trained counselors who are, part of their organizations, and they counsel you and try to help you to come to to deal with to manage your alienation and depression, both before and after coming out of the closet. So the thing then is to go to their meetings, become aware of these support groups. I think that there are a large number of them now. Hamsafar, Sampathik Trust, Hangama in Bangalore, Lakshya in Baroda, Nas Foundation in Delhi. You just Google and Lucknow has its group, Hyderabad has a group, even smaller towns have groups.
Even in Pune, IPH has a support group wherein they every once in a month they meet and they discuss about the mental health, about, as you have asked the question, after coming out of the closet. So they take care of these issues.
The medical aspect is best left to medical professionals and trained psychiatrists. But here also I would caution you because there are a lot of quacks. Tomorrow I will read from a book that talks about Malaysia and how there are these quacks who claim that through religion and so on you can, and of course Ramdev in India also has been saying that through pranayam you can cure homosexuality. So you have to be careful about who they have to be sensible doctors. not doctors who fool you, and not doctors who see it as a sickness, because it's not a sickness anymore, not thought of as a sickness anymore. So that's the medical aspect. Medical in the sense of mental health, it's not a physical sickness. It's not that you're physically sick the way you are if you have TB or some disease. But support groups, I think, are more important because you meet other people. Even doing a course like this, I guess that by the time you finish this 3-month program, you'll be able to see this somewhat differently, right? Because we're talking about these things over a period of 3 months. Going to support group meetings, and they also have sessions for parents. If some of you are parents and you think your children are gay, or if they've come out to you, or you think that they are gay but they are afraid to come out, going to sessions organized especially for parents can be very helpful.
Swikar is there in Mumbai. Swikar.
Yeah, Swikar in Bombay.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, schools which require sex education are sadly lacking in providing adequate sex education. If this was tackled at the school level, believe me, half the problems of what you talk about, alienation, depression, and so on, would take care of themselves. But schools have shown a great reluctance, to broach the subject of sexuality, and that's unfortunate. Okay, more questions tomorrow.
This is done for today.
Yeah, anything else we'll take up a broader session tomorrow. We're continuing. I wanted to talk a little bit about, I've been to Japan. Now we've talked so far about the West, but Eastern countries, Malaysia, East Asian countries, Uganda, and notorious. So a little bit about that tomorrow, and then we can answer more questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. If you have more questions, we will surely take tomorrow. Thank you. And we will be sharing the list of references that Professor Rao has mentioned in today's lecture. Have a great evening, guys.